Alex Hollister stared at the wooden box. It was buried 15 feet down, at the bottom of a dry well everyone in the family called worthless. A joke. The metal lock was still there, a dark shape against the old wood, somehow untouched by the decades it had spent in the damp earth. But that wasn't what made his hands shake. It wasn't the weight of the box or the stale air in the well. He held the lantern closer, the yellow light dancing across the surface. And he saw them. Fresh scratches. Bright, raw gashes in the metal around the lock. It looked like someone had tried to pry it open. Recently. Someone who knew exactly where to dig. Someone who knew about his uncle's secret. And that someone could be anywhere. They could be watching him right now from the rim of the well, a silhouette against the pale morning sky. The reading of Uncle Thomas's will had been the worst day of Alex's life, a public shaming dressed up in legal jargon. He'd stood there in Lawyer Morrison's stuffy little office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and his cousin's cheap cologne. He watched them get everything, the sprawling ranch, the herds of cattle fat from grazing on green pastures, the grand main house with its porch that wrapped all the way around. And what did Alex get? A piece of paper, a deed, for 40 acres of barren ground that grew nothing but rocks and thorns. And of course, the dry well. A well that hadn't seen a drop of water in 20 years. His cousins didn't even try to hide their laughter. They slapped each other on the back, their grins wide and cruel. Poor Alex, stuck with the wasteland. At least you can dig for water, his cousin Marcus had sneered. The sound of his brand new boots clicked sharp and loud on the floorboards. Maybe you'll get lucky. Find enough to wash your clothes. The laughter that erupted after that had burned hotter than any desert sun. It scraped him raw. Alex didn't say a word. He just turned and walked out. The deed crumpled in his sweating fist. He could feel their contempt pressing down on him, heavy as a pile of stones. 3 long days on dusty trails brought him here, to this patch of cracked, forgotten earth, this kingdom of disappointment. But Uncle Thomas had been the smartest man Alex ever knew. He was the one who taught Alex how to read the words in a book and how to read the tracks of a coyote in the dust. The old man never did a single thing without a damn good reason. So standing at the edge of that well this morning, Alex had looked for the reason, and he'd found something that didn't add up. The wooden cover over the well opening was newer than the rest of it. The wood was less gray, less weathered, and there were rope marks gouged into the sides, fresh marks. That's when he decided to go down. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just knew he had to look. The descent was a nightmare. He trusted his weight to an old rope that his uncle must have replaced not long ago. His boots scraped against the stone walls, sending pebbles rattling down into the darkness below. 20 feet down, his feet hit solid ground. Not mud, not water, just dry, packed earth. Just like everyone said. The well was dry, but it wasn't empty. Someone had been here, digging. The signs were everywhere. Fresh tool marks scarred the circular walls of the well. Loose dirt was piled up, not randomly, but in a way that suggested someone had been excavating, searching for something specific. And then his shovel struck something hard, wood. He'd found the box. It was buried with incredible precision, right in the dead center of the well's floor, as if whoever put it there had measured the spot down to the inch. The wood was ancient, but it had been wrapped in thick, oiled cloth, protecting it from the earth. But those scratches, those bright, angry scratches around the lock told a completely different story. Someone else had found this box first. Someone else had tried to get inside, and they had failed. Alex ran his trembling fingers over the rough metal where a tool had scraped and scraped, trying to break the lock. His heart was a drum against his ribs. The implications were staggering. If someone else knew about this box, they knew what was supposed to be inside it. They knew its value. And if they failed to open it once, they would absolutely be coming back to try again. He hauled himself out of the well, the heavy box tucked under one arm, his shirt plastered to his skin with cold sweat. The world looked different now. Every shadow seemed to hide a man. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. He carried the box to the only other structure on his new property, a dilapidated old shed about 30 yards from the well. Inside, the air was thick with dust. Beams of sunlight cut through the gaps in the walls, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes. Alex cleared a space on a makeshift table and set the box down. The sound echoed in the silence. He leaned in, examining the lock more closely in the better light. It was a serious piece of hardware, the kind you'd see on a bank vault door, not on a rancher's keepsake box. Uncle Thomas had not been messing around. The scratches were definitely fresh. Someone had used a file, maybe even a heavy knife. They had worked hard at it, trying to cut right through the thick metal hasp, but they had stopped. Why? Why would you get this far, this close to opening it, and then just give up? He studied the pattern of the scratches. They weren't hurried or frantic. They were methodical, but they stopped abruptly, as if the person had been interrupted. A sound from outside made him go rigid. Footsteps. Someone was crunching through the dry grass, walking straight for the shed. Alex's mind went into overdrive. He threw an old greasy tarpaulin over the box, hiding it from view, and scrambled to the single dirty window. He peered through the grime. A man was approaching, tall, broad-shouldered, with a pistol holstered on his hip. Alex recognized him immediately. Caleb Dunn. Caleb owned the ranch that bordered Alex's new property, a successful ranch with green fields and plenty of water. Caleb was known for two things: his prize-winning cattle and his habit of expanding his land holdings, often using methods that weren't strictly legal. Uncle Thomas had never ever trusted the man, and in that instant, Alex knew why. "Alex Hollister!" Caleb's voice boomed across the dusty yard. It was a friendly voice, but it was the kind of friendly you hear from a wolf just before it bites. "Heard you finally came to claim your inheritance. Sorry for your loss, son. Though I reckon Thomas did you no favors, leaving you this worthless patch of dirt." Alex took a deep breath and stepped out of the shed. He made sure to stand right in front of the door, blocking the view inside. "Afternoon, Caleb. Just looking over what's mine." Caleb's eyes were like chips of ice. They darted everywhere, taking in the broken fence, the dry water trough, Alex's dusty clothes, and the well. His eyes lingered on the well. "Must be a real disappointment," Caleb said, his lips pulling back into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Getting stuck with this while your cousins got all the good stuff. But I've been thinking, maybe I could take this burden off your hands, give you a fair price, enough to make a fresh start somewhere else." "Not interested in selling," Alex said, his voice flat. "A smart man considers all his options." Caleb's gaze drifted back to the well. "Especially when those options include not going thirsty. That well's been dry longer than most folks can remember. Makes a man wonder." He let the word hang in the air. Wonder why old Thomas kept this land at all. The way Caleb said it sent a shiver down Alex's spine. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. There was a hidden meaning in those words, a dark knowledge that suggested Caleb knew a whole lot more about Uncle Thomas's reasons than he was letting on. "Maybe he had his reasons," Alex said, choosing his words with care. Caleb's smile widened, but it never reached his cold eyes. "Oh, I'm sure he did. Thomas was always full of surprises. The real question is, did he share any of those surprises with you before he passed?" The air grew thick and heavy, like right before a thunderstorm. The question wasn't just a question. It was a threat. It was a test. Caleb was fishing, trying to see what Alex knew. Alex kept his face a perfect mask of indifference, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Can't say that he did. Uncle Thomas wasn't one for sharing family secrets." Caleb took a step closer, then another. He was so close now that Alex could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. He could see the hungry, calculating look in his pale blue eyes. "Funny thing about secrets, Alex," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial whisper. "They have a way of surfacing, especially when there's money involved. Your uncle knew that better than most." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means Thomas and I had some business dealings over the years," Caleb said, glancing toward the well again. "That well, everything kept coming back to that well. Nothing official, you understand. Just an understanding between neighbors. He owed me a debt, see? A debt that didn't get settled before he passed on." A knot of ice formed in Alex's stomach. "What kind of debt?" "The kind that transfers to the next of kin," Caleb's smile was as sharp and cruel as a shard of glass. See, your uncle borrowed a substantial sum of money from me about 5 years back. Said he needed it for improvements on his property. But the funny thing is, I never saw any improvements made over at the main ranch. The implication hit Alex like a physical blow, a punch to the gut that stole his breath. If Uncle Thomas had borrowed money and used this specific, worthless piece of land as collateral, then Caleb could have a legal claim to it. The joke of an inheritance was about to become no inheritance at all. You got papers? Alex demanded, his voice tight. Papers to prove this debt? Oh, I got his signature on a promissory note, Caleb said with an air of smug satisfaction. Dated and witnessed, all proper-like. The terms were generous, of course. I told Thomas he could pay me back whenever he was able. We were neighbors after all. Caleb's eyes gleamed. But now that he's gone, well, that changes things. Considerably. Alex's mind was a whirlwind. Nothing made sense. Uncle Thomas was careful with money. He was frugal to a fault. For him to borrow a large sum from a man like Caleb Dunn, there had to be a powerful reason. And if he had used this land as collateral instead of the valuable main ranch, that meant something too. Something important. How much? Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper. Caleb named the figure with casual cruelty. $2,000 plus 5 years of accumulated interest comes to about $3,000 total. He knew. He knew Alex didn't have that kind of money. He probably didn't have $30 to his name. Now, I'm not an unreasonable man, Caleb continued, enjoying himself. I'm willing to just take this patch of dirt to settle the debt. We'll call it even. A clean slate. No hard feelings. $3,000, it might as well have been $3 million. Alex had $47 in his pocket and no way on earth to earn more anytime soon. The land that had been a symbol of his family's scorn was now about to be snatched away, taking with it the secret hidden in that box. I'll need to see those papers, Alex said. He was stalling, buying himself time to think. Naturally, Caleb purred. I'll have my lawyer draw them up proper. I'll bring them by tomorrow morning. That should give you plenty of time to think about your options. He tipped his hat in a gesture of mock politeness. Then he turned to leave but stopped. He looked back at Alex, a dark glint in his eye. Of course, he said slowly. There's always the possibility that your uncle left something valuable on this property. Something that could help you with the debt. Might be worth taking a real thorough look around before you make any big decisions. The threat was no longer veiled. It was as clear and sharp as a knife's edge. Caleb didn't just suspect. He knew. He knew about the box. Tomorrow he would come back with his fraudulent papers to steal the land legally. But tonight he might come back for the box. And he wouldn't be asking politely. Alex stood there, frozen, as Caleb mounted his horse and rode away. He watched until the dust cloud from the horse's hooves had completely disappeared over the barren hills. Only then did he turn and stumble back into the shed. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely pull the tarpaulin off the box. $3,000. The number echoed in his head. A death sentence for his future. Even if the box was filled with cash, it would have to be a fortune to cover a debt that large and leave anything for him to build a life with. He spent the next hour trying to open the lock. He used a rusted knife he found on a shelf, then a piece of thick wire. It was no use. The lock was expertly made. Uncle Thomas had chosen his security with care. Alex needed real tools, or he needed another way in, a way that wouldn't destroy whatever was inside. The scratches around the lock were a testament to how difficult the task was. Someone else, probably with better tools, had already tried and given up. The afternoon sun began to sink, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The shadows grew long and distorted, turning the thorny brush into monstrous shapes. Alex knew he couldn't stay here. Caleb, or men working for him, would be back as soon as it was dark. He made a decision. It was risky, but staying put was even riskier. He loaded the heavy wooden box into the back of the rickety old wagon that had come with the land. He hitched up the tired-looking horse and set off toward the nearest town. The settlement was called Millhaven. It wasn't much more than a cluster of dusty buildings clinging to life around a general store and a saloon. But it was also where Adele Cross ran her boarding house. Adele was more than just a boarding house owner. She was the town's unofficial historian, the keeper of secrets, She knew the stories and dealings of everyone in the county, and what she didn't know, she could usually figure out. She had known Uncle Thomas for years. If anyone could shed some light on his mysterious activities and his connection to Caleb Dunn, it was her. The boarding house was a plain, two-story building on the main street. Alex found Adele in the kitchen, a cloud of flour dusting her apron as she prepared the evening meal for her guests. She was a woman in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through you. She looked up as Alex entered, and her expression softened. "Alex Hollister," she said, wiping her hands. "Heard you came into your uncle's dry well. I'm sorry for your loss. Thomas was a good man, kept to himself, maybe too much, but a good man." "That's why I'm here, Adele," Alex said, his voice low. He glanced around the kitchen, making sure no one else was listening. "Did Uncle Thomas ever say anything to you about owing money? To Caleb Dunn?" Adele's expression went from sympathetic to hard as flint in a heartbeat. "Caleb Dunn," she spat the name like it was poison. "He's been spreading that story all over town since the will was read. Claims Thomas owed him a fortune. But I'll tell you this, Alex. Your uncle was not a man who would take a single penny from a snake like Caleb, let alone borrow a fortune from him. He came to see me today," Alex said, "talked about a promissory note, said he had papers." "Papers can be forged," Adele said, her dark eyes flashing, "especially when the man who supposedly signed them is 6 feet under. Now, what I can tell you is this. For the past 5 years, your uncle came into town like clockwork, regular as the seasons. He always carried a small leather satchel with him. He'd go to the bank, the general store, sometimes the telegraph office. Never said much about his business, but he always had the look of a man on a mission, a man working on something important." A tiny spark of hope flickered to life in Alex's chest. Did he ever say what it was? What he was working on? "Not in so many words," Adele admitted, moving closer and lowering her voice. "But I once overheard him talking to the bank manager. He was asking about mineral rights, land surveys. Seemed to think there might be something valuable out on that property of his, something nobody else knew about." She paused, her gaze intense. "Of course, if a man like Caleb Dunn is suddenly so keen on collecting a phantom debt from a dead man, it might be because he's heard the same rumors." The pieces were falling into place. A terrifying picture was beginning to form in Alex's mind. Uncle Thomas hadn't left him a patch of worthless dirt as a cruel joke. He had left him a secret so valuable that Caleb Dunn was willing to forge documents, threaten, and maybe even kill to get his hands on it. Without another word, Alex went back out to his wagon. He struggled back into the kitchen with the heavy wooden box and set it down on Adele's large wooden table. The late afternoon light slanted through the window, making the fresh scratches on the lock gleam. Adele leaned over it, her eyes sharp and focused. She ran a single knowing finger along the damaged metal. "These are fresh," she declared. "No more than a week old. Whoever did this was in a hurry, and they knew exactly where to find this box." "But how?" Alex asked, the question that had been tormenting him for hours. "How did they know?" "That's the question that should be keeping you up at night," Adele said grimly. "And if Caleb knows about this box, he's not going to stop. He'll be back for it." A determined look came over Adele's face. She disappeared into a back room for a moment and returned with a small, worn leather case. She unrolled it on the table, revealing a set of slender, delicate metal tools. "My late husband," she explained, "was a locksmith back east. Before he passed, he taught me a thing or two." She selected a thin metal probe and a small tension wrench. She peered into the lock's mechanism, her expression one of deep concentration. "This is a fine piece of work, a very good lock, but nothing is impossible to open if you know what you're doing." As Adele began to work, her fingers moving with a deft, practiced skill, Alex stood watch by the kitchen window. He scanned the dusty main street, his eyes searching for any sign of Caleb or his men. The town was quiet. A few horses were tied to the hitching post outside the saloon. A wagon rumbled by. But Alex couldn't shake the unnerving feeling that they were being watched. That somewhere, from a darkened window or a shadowy alley, a pair of eyes was fixed on the boarding house. "Tell me more about these mineral rights," Alex said, his voice a low murmur. He needed to distract himself from the tightening knot of fear in his gut. Adele didn't look up from her work. He started asking about them about 5 years ago. Right around the same time, Caleb now claims Thomas borrowed all that money from him. Funny timing, isn't it? She paused, letting out a frustrated sigh as a tumbler inside the lock refused to budge. Thomas would come in, buy his usual supplies, then spend an hour at the county clerk's office, looking through old maps and territorial records. He was obsessed with old mining claims, the ones from the early days, before the surveyors had properly mapped everything out. There was a soft click, then another, and another. A final, satisfying thunk echoed in the quiet kitchen. Adele sat back, a triumphant smile on her face. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow. There we go. Your uncle chose his security well, but he never planned on a locksmith's widow. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt dizzy with anticipation. This was it, the secret his uncle had died to protect. Adele lifted the heavy wooden lid. Inside there was no gold, no cash, just bundles of paper, neatly wrapped in more oiled cloth and tied with faded red ribbon. The top bundle consisted of official-looking documents, stamped with territorial seals and covered in dense, legal script. Beneath them were hand-drawn maps, meticulously detailed sketches of rock formations, and a thick leather-bound folder with Thomas's name inscribed on the cover in his neat, careful handwriting. "Well, I'll be," Adele whispered. She carefully lifted out one of the official documents. Her eyes scanned the page, widening with every line she read. "Alex," she said, her voice filled with awe, "this is a territorial survey report. It's dated 18 months ago. It says here, it says a geological team found significant copper deposits." She paused, her finger tracing a line of text. "On a tract of land described as..." She read the legal description of the property, her voice trembling slightly. She looked up at Alex, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Alex, this is your land, the land you inherited, the area around the dry well." The world tilted on its axis. The floor seemed to fall away beneath his feet. Worthless land. The family joke. Uncle Thomas hadn't left him a desert. He had left him a copper mine. A mine that, according to the report, could be worth thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. But a new question immediately surfaced. If his uncle had known about this for 18 months, why hadn't he done anything? Why hadn't he started mining? Why keep it a secret? The answer was in the thick folder. Adele opened it, spreading its contents across the table. Inside were copies of legal papers, letters, newspaper clippings, and pages upon pages of handwritten notes. It was a detailed, systematic investigation. And on the very top of the pile was a letter. It was in Thomas's familiar script. It was addressed to Alex, and it was dated 1 week before he died. He knew, Alex said, his voice choked with emotion. He knew he was dying, and he knew someone was trying to steal this from him. He picked up the letter. His hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. He began to read it aloud. "My dear Alex, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I prayed would remain hidden until the time was right. The land I have left you is not what it seems. It contains a vein of copper so rich it will make you a wealthy man, wealthier than anyone in our family has ever dreamed of being. But this great wealth has also made you a target, long before you even knew it existed." Adele leaned closer, her breath held, as Alex's voice filled the quiet kitchen. "5 years ago, I found some unusual rock formations near the well. I hired a geological survey team out of the capital. What they found was a copper vein that runs deep into the earth. Based on their estimates, it could be worth $50,000, maybe more. I told no one, only the territorial surveyor who filed the official report. I thought the secret was safe." Alex had to pause, his throat tight. He took a shaky breath and continued reading the next paragraph. "But I made a terrible mistake. I trusted the wrong person with a piece of this knowledge. Caleb Dunn found out about the copper. I don't know how, but he did. And for years he has been plotting to steal this land from me. The debt he claims I owe him is a complete fabrication. He has created forged documents, and I fear they will be convincing enough to hold up in our corrupt local courts." The full, monstrous scope of Caleb's plan hit Alex like a tidal wave. He hadn't just been sniffing around based on rumors. He knew. He knew everything. And he had spent years patiently laying a trap, waiting for Thomas to die so he could spring it. "Look at this," Adele whispered, her voice sharp. She pointed to another document from the folder. "Your uncle wasn't just protecting his mine. He was investigating Caleb. He was building a case against him." The folder was filled with it. Detailed records of Caleb's land acquisitions, legal disputes, and something far more sinister. Newspaper clippings about the mysterious deaths of other landowners. Landowners whose property Caleb had conveniently acquired shortly after their untimely passing. "My God," Adele said, looking up at Alex, her face pale. "Thomas wasn't just documenting fraud. He was documenting a pattern of murder." Alex's eyes scanned the final lines of his uncle's letter. "I have hidden the original, sealed geological survey report in this box, where Caleb cannot find it. Along with it is all the evidence I have gathered of his other crimes. If anything happens to me, you must take these documents directly to Judge Harrison in the territorial capital. He is one of the few men in a position of power who cannot be bought or intimidated. Do not trust anyone else. Do not stop for any reason. Your life depends on it." As the last word left Alex's lips, another sound cut through the evening quiet. The sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse, several, approaching fast. Alex and Adele both froze, their eyes locking in shared terror. Through the kitchen window, they saw three riders pulling up in front of the boarding house. Caleb Dunn was in the lead. Flanking him were two hard-faced men Alex had never seen before. They weren't ranch hands. They were professionals. The kind of men you hire when you need a problem solved quietly and permanently. "He knows," Alex gasped, scrambling to gather the precious documents. "He must have followed me. He was waiting for me to open it." Adele moved with a speed that defied her age. She helped Alex shove the papers back into the box and slammed the lid shut. She grabbed his arm, her grip like iron, and pulled him towards a small door at the back of the kitchen. "That door leads to the alley," she said, her voice a fierce whisper. "There's a livery stable 3 blocks north. Hide there. Stay there until it's safe to move. Judge Harrison is holding court in the Capitol next week. It's a 2-day ride. If you can get this box to him, Alex, you can destroy Caleb Dunn." The hoofbeats stopped. Heavy boots stomped onto the wooden front porch. Caleb's voice, no longer friendly, echoed through the walls. "Check the stables out back. And the shed. If Hollister is in this town, he has something that belongs to me." A heavy fist pounded on the front door of the boarding house. Clutching the box to his chest like a shield, Alex slipped out the back door and into the deepening darkness of the alley. The race for his inheritance and for his life had just begun. The alley was a narrow channel of darkness between the boarding house and the general store. Alex pressed himself against the rough wooden wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The box felt impossibly heavy. He could hear Caleb's men shouting in the street, their voices sharp and angry. They were fanning out, a net tightening around the center of town. He had minutes, maybe less, before they found the back alley. He ran. He kept to the shadows, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. The stable Adele had told him about was a large weathered barn at the far end of Millhaven. Its silhouette was a dark smudge against a sky full of stars. He slipped in through a side door that was slightly ajar, the scent of hay and horses enveloping him. It was a familiar, comforting smell from a life that now seemed a million miles away. He found an empty stall in the back and sank down into the straw, his heart a wild bird beating against his ribs. He had to think. He couldn't just hide here all night. They would search every building. It was only a matter of time. By the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the barn walls, he opened the box again. He needed to be sure. He needed to understand the full weight of what his uncle had left him. The geological report was even more detailed than he'd realized. It included core sample analysis, projected yields, and even recommendations for the best mining techniques. The number floated in his mind, surreal and dizzying. $50,000. It was a king's ransom, enough to change not just his life, but the future of his entire family. But it was the other documents, the evidence of Caleb's crimes, that made his blood run cold. Uncle Thomas had been a detective. He had documented everything with painstaking precision. There were copies of land deeds with forged signatures, witness statements from people who had been intimidated by Caleb's men, and the newspaper articles about the three dead landowners. Beside each article, his uncle had written notes connecting the dots. One man had supposedly fallen from his own roof while making repairs. Another had been found drowned in a shallow creek. A third had died in a hunting accident. All three had publicly refused to sell their land to Caleb Dunn just weeks before their deaths. And in each case, a mysterious, previously unknown debt had surfaced, allowing Caleb to claim their property from their grieving families through the courts. It was a pattern of cold-blooded murder for profit, and Alex was holding the only proof. A new sound made him freeze. Hoofbeats, slow and deliberate, coming down the alley right outside the stable. He peered through a crack in the wooden wall. Two of Caleb's hired guns. They were riding slowly, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. They were checking every door, every window, methodical, professional. Staying in Millhaven was a death sentence. He had to get to the territorial capital. He had to get this box to Judge Harrison. He looked around the stable. In one of the stalls was a strong-looking bay mare, saddled and ready as if waiting for a traveler. On a nearby hook hung a saddle and bridle. It was a desperate gamble, but he had no other choice. He found the stable owner's small office. On the desk, he left $3 silver. It was more than enough to pay for the horse. A small act of honesty in a night filled with theft and deception. He worked quickly and quietly, his hands moving with a purpose he didn't know he possessed. He led the mare to the large back entrance of the stable, away from the street. Just as he was about to swing himself into the saddle, he heard a shout from the center of town. They must have discovered he was no longer in the boarding house. The hunt was escalating. Lanterns bobbed and weaved between the buildings as Caleb organized a full-scale search. Alex didn't hesitate. He secured the precious box behind the saddle, swung himself up, and urged the horse into a silent trot. He stuck to the back paths and dark fields that bordered the town, circling around until he found the main trail heading east. Once he was clear of Millhaven, he didn't look back. He leaned low over the horse's neck and spurred it into a gallop, the wind whipping at his face. He was riding into the vast, dark emptiness of the plains, a lone figure fleeing a storm of greed and violence. Behind him, the lights of the search party were like angry fireflies. They grew smaller and smaller, but Alex knew they wouldn't give up. The chase was on, and the stakes were everything. The next 2 days were a blur of dust, fear, and exhaustion. Alex rode until the horse was lathered in sweat. Then he would walk it, letting it graze on what little grass it could find, while he chewed on the stale bread Adele had pressed into his hands before he fled. He barely slept, catching an hour or two at a time in hidden ravines or thickets of brush, always with one ear open for the sound of pursuit. He felt hunted. Every shadow was a rider. Every rustle in the grass was an approaching footstep. He pushed himself and the horse to their limits, driven by the memory of his uncle's last words and the cold, dead eyes of Caleb Dunn. On the afternoon of the second day, he saw it, the territorial capital. It was a sprawling collection of brick and wooden buildings on the horizon, a symbol of law and order in a lawless land. A wave of relief so powerful it almost made him weep washed over him. He found the courthouse, a formidable stone building with tall columns. He stumbled inside, his clothes torn and filthy, the wooden box clutched in his arms. He must have looked like a madman. He asked a clerk for Judge Harrison and was led to a large office lined with books from floor to ceiling. The judge was an older man with a stern face and spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked Alex up and down with a skeptical eye. "What is the meaning of this?" the judge demanded, his voice stern. Alex didn't waste time with explanations. He simply put the box on the judge's massive oak desk and opened it. He laid out the documents one by one. The official geological survey, the forged promissory note, his uncle's meticulous records, the newspaper clippings, the handwritten letter. Judge Harrison began to read. The skepticism on his face slowly melted away, replaced by a look of grim understanding and then of cold fury. He read every single page, his expression growing darker with each new piece of evidence. The office was completely silent, save for the rustle of paper. When he finally finished, he looked up at Alex, his eyes full of a righteous anger. Mr. Hollister, he said, his voice low and dangerous, these documents, this is some of the most damning evidence of systematic corruption and murder I have seen in 20 years on the bench. Your uncle was a brave man. He was building a case that could have sent Caleb Dunn and half the officials in that county to the gallows. Alex sagged in his chair, the adrenaline that had sustained him for 2 days finally draining away, leaving him utterly spent. Is it enough? He asked, his voice hoarse. Is it enough to stop him from taking my land? Judge Harrison stood up, his presence filling the room. More than enough, son. This official survey solidifies your legal claim to those mineral rights beyond any dispute, and these records prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that Caleb's debt claim is a complete and utter fraud. He gathered the papers into a neat, damning pile. I am issuing a warrant for the immediate arrest of Caleb Dunn on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit murder. I am also dispatching a unit of territorial marshals. They will ride to your property and protect it. They will ensure that no one sets foot on your land until this entire matter is settled in a court of law. 3 weeks later, Alex stood on a ridge overlooking his 40 acres. It was no longer a barren wasteland. It was the bustling center of a new mining operation. Dozens of men worked below, their shouts and the clang of their tools echoing in the clear air. They were pulling copper ore from the ground, ore that was making him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. The trial had been a formality. Faced with Uncle Thomas's ironclad evidence, Caleb's hired guns had turned on him, testifying against their former employer in exchange for lighter sentences. Caleb Dunn himself now resided in the territorial prison. He had been convicted on all counts, and new murder charges were being filed as the suspicious deaths of the other landowners were officially reinvestigated. The empire he had built on greed and blood had crumbled to dust. The change in Alex's life was so sudden, so absolute, it felt like a dream. The dry well, once a symbol of his humiliation, was now the heart of his fortune. The very cousins who had laughed him out of the lawyer's office now wrote him letters, begging for loans, offering him investment schemes, their words dripping with a false sweetness that made him sick. Adele Cross had agreed to manage the business side of the mine. Her sharp mind and unerring honesty proved to be as valuable as the copper itself. She still ran her boarding house, but the generous salary Alex paid her meant she could hire help and finally make the improvements she'd always dreamed of. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the rolling hills that were now his, Alex thought about his uncle's final gift. It wasn't just the money, it was the lesson. A lesson in patience, in courage, and in the quiet power of the truth. The worthless inheritance had become his legacy. He turned and walked toward the new house he was building on the hill overlooking the mine. It was a fine house, larger and grander than the one his cousins had inherited. Tucked in his pocket was a letter he had written that morning. It was an offer, addressed to his cousins, to buy their ranch land at a fair market price. The tables had turned. The beggar who had inherited a dry well was now a king, and justice, just as his uncle had planned it, had finally been served. If you enjoyed this story of hidden treasure and long-awaited justice, click the video on your screen now for another incredible tale of courage against all odds. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support is what allows us to keep finding and sharing these amazing stories with you.